Hi, I'm Robby Codependent, para-alcoholic. The topic of this video is Huna prayer. When Tony A introduced his new steps, the Tony A steps, to the fellowship in 1991, he specifically mentioned the Kahuna Philosophy, which I'm referencing here. He only mentioned it briefly, but it sparked my interest enough to read 2 books on the Kahuna, which I'll reference in the description below. And it made me see why he had mentioned them in what he described as the most important talk he ever gave. Because the Huna prayer philosophy honors the inner child. The Kahuna believed that it was the inner child who connected with the higher self and allowed prayers to be transmitted. But this is not to be taken for granted, because the inner child has a will of its own. So you must earn its trust and cooperation. Before I continue, I want to define a few things. In Hawaiian culture, Huna means secret wisdom. Kahuna is a specialist or keeper of this wisdom. The ancient shaman or medicine men of Hawaii were Kahuna. They believed that man was comprised of 3 parts: a middle self, which corresponds to ordinary everyday consciousness; a higher self, which was not physically attached to the body, but rather floated a few inches above it; and a lower self, which corresponded to what Sigmund Freud would later refer to as the unconscious. And what resides in the unconscious? All of our childhood trauma, in the form of repressed shame, grief, and fear, which ACA refers to as the inner child. In addition, they believed that prayer involved a chain of command and cooperation between all 3 parts. While they were initiated by the middle self, it was the inner child who possessed the telepathy required to communicate the prayer to the higher self, which floated a few inches above the head. The middle self could not do this on its own, and therefore needed the cooperation of the inner child. And the key word here is cooperation, because if the child didn't like the prayer, it could refuse to pass it along. However, assuming the child was okay with it, it would transmit the prayer to the higher self, which then began another layer of scrutiny. The higher self has more wisdom than the middle self, and if it thought the prayer will do more harm than good, it would put the kibosh on it. End of story. Therefore, your prayer needed to have the approval of your complete being, all 3 selves. If this sounds far-fetched, then consider the following steps. Step 6, we became entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. Step 7, we humbly asked Him to remove our shortcomings. This tells me that I must be entirely ready to let go before God will take my defects. If I want to hold on longer, He'll let me. In other words, you wouldn't blame God for not taking your defects. Instead, you would work on boosting your willingness. Therefore, the question becomes, what prevents me from being entirely ready? Or rather, what part of me wants to hold on? I think it's possible to be 100% ready on a conscious level while being not so ready on an unconscious level, especially when we're dealing with character defects that are rooted in survival traits. Another word for survival trait is defense mechanism. And where do these survival traits and defense mechanisms reside? You got it, in the unconscious part of the mind. For example, I may desire to stop being a people pleaser on a conscious level, but my inner child may be quite nervous about putting down a tool that has kept them safe in the past. Therefore, I may pray for God to remove my approval-seeking ways, but according to the Kahuna, that prayer will never go out. And if you're truly not ready to face the possible rejection that might go along with it, your higher self would likely kibosh it as well. The solution to this problem is simple. Involve your inner child and higher self on a conscious level They're already involved on an unconscious level. By considering them before you begin to pray, by trying to make them feel safe, feel loved, by keeping them involved in the process, you will slowly gain their trust as well as their cooperation. This is one of the many ways to integrate our inner parts. And that pretty much wraps up this video. If you got something out of it, please click like and subscribe. And if you really want to make my day, then leave a comment as well. I'm Robby Bobby. Thank you for listening. And as always, keep coming back.